Tonight, we're going to visit the one moon in the Jupiter system that NASA once considered the safest place to build a human outpost. Callisto. It sits beyond Jupiter's deadliest radiation belts. Its surface is geologically stable. It has water ice as far as its instruments can see. On paper, it looks like the obvious place to start. But when you strip away the optimism and look at what daily life would actually require on this frozen world, almost 500 million miles from Earth, the picture changes completely. Every breath manufactured, every watt of heat generated by a nuclear reactor that cannot be allowed to fail, every emergency faced alone, with the nearest help more than half an hour away at the speed of light. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand why the safest moon near Jupiter is still a terrifying place to live. Before we get started, if you love exploring the depths of space as much as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Also, before we begin, we're now live on Spotify. The link's in the description if you'd like to listen to us wherever you are. Are you comfortable? Now, let's begin. Jupiter is not a place that welcomes visitors. It is the largest planet in the solar system, a ball of hydrogen and helium more than 11 times the diameter of Earth, with a mass greater than all the other planets combined. It spins so fast that its day lasts less than 10 hours, and that rotation drives weather systems powerful enough to swallow entire worlds. The Great Red Spot alone, a storm that has been raging for centuries, is wider than Earth. Jupiter has no solid surface. If you tried to descend into its atmosphere, you would pass through layers of increasingly dense gas, the pressure rising steadily, the temperature climbing until eventually the hydrogen around you would be compressed so intensely that it would behave like a liquid metal. There's no ground to stand on. There's no place to land. Jupiter itself is not a destination for human beings. It is a force of nature, a gravitational anchor that dominates a region of space stretching millions of kilometers in every direction. But the planet itself is not what makes the Jupiter system dangerous to human beings. The danger comes from something you cannot see with your eyes. It comes from the magnetosphere. Jupiter has the most powerful magnetic field of any planet in the solar system. It is roughly 20,000 times stronger than Earth's. If you could see Jupiter's magnetosphere, it would appear larger than the full moon in our sky, even though Jupiter is hundreds of millions of miles away. That magnetic field does something terrible. It traps charged particles, protons and electrons accelerated to enormous energies by Jupiter's rapid rotation and volcanic material ejected from the moon, Io, and concentrates them into radiation belts that surround the planet like invisible rings of destruction. These belts extend outward from Jupiter in layers, and anything caught inside them is bombarded with ionizing radiation intense enough to destroy electronics, degrade materials, and kill living tissue. The innermost regions are the worst. Near Jupiter, the radiation environment is so extreme that even heavily shielded robotic spacecraft can only survive limited exposure. The Galileo orbiter, which studied Jupiter and its moons from 1995 to 2003, accumulated so much radiation damage over its 8-year mission that many of its instruments degraded significantly before the spacecraft was deliberately plunged into Jupiter's atmosphere to avoid contaminating the moons it had spent years studying. This is the environment that surrounds the 4 largest moons of Jupiter. The Galilean satellites, discovered by Galileo Galilei in 1610, are named Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. They are among the most scientifically fascinating objects in the solar system. Each one is a world in its own right, with its own geology, its own history, its own set of mysteries. And each one has been discussed, at one time or another, as a potential target for human exploration or even settlement. But when you actually look at what each of these moons offers a human being trying to stay alive, the list of options narrows very quickly. And it narrows for reasons that are worth understanding in detail, because the process of elimination is what makes Callisto's reputation possible in the first place. To understand why Callisto looks like the answer, you first have to understand why everything else in the Jupiter system is not. Start with Io. It is the innermost of the 4 Galilean moons, orbiting Jupiter at a distance of roughly 422,000 kilometers. It is slightly larger than Earth's moon, with a diameter of about 3,642 kilometers. And it is, without exaggeration, one of the most violent places in the solar system. Io is the most volcanically active body known to science. Its surface is covered with hundreds of active volcanoes, some of which erupt plumes of sulfur and sulfur dioxide more than 300 kilometers into space. The volcanic activity is so intense and so continuous that the entire surface is resurfaced by lava flows on a timescale of roughly 1 million years, which in geological terms is the blink of an eye. There are almost no impact craters visible on Io, because every crater that forms is buried under fresh volcanic material before long. The reason for all this activity is tidal heating. Io is caught in a gravitational tug-of-war between Jupiter and the other Galilean moons, particularly Europa and Ganymede, which are locked in an orbital resonance with Io. For every 4 orbits Io completes around Jupiter, Europa completes exactly 2, and Ganymede completes exactly 1. This resonance keeps the orbits from circularizing, and the resulting eccentricity means that as Io moves closer to and farther from Jupiter during each orbit, Jupiter's immense gravity flexes and squeezes the moon's interior like a stress ball in a giant's hand. That mechanical deformation generates friction, which generates heat, enormous amounts of heat, enough heat to melt rock and drive the most powerful volcanism in the solar system. The surface is a patchwork of volcanic plains, sulfur frost, and glowing lava lakes. The colors are striking, yellows and oranges and reds and blacks, a world that looks almost painted. But none of it is hospitable. Surface temperatures near the volcanic vents can exceed 1,700 degrees Celsius, while the background surface temperature sits at roughly minus 130 degrees Celsius. And Io sits deep inside Jupiter's radiation belts. The radiation dose at Io's surface is approximately 3,600 rem per day. A dose of roughly 400 rem delivered over a short period is generally considered lethal to humans without medical intervention. On Io, you would absorb a lethal dose in roughly 2.5 hours. No shielding that a surface habitat could reasonably provide would make Io survivable for any extended period. Io is not a candidate for human habitation. It is a candidate for observation from a very safe distance. Europa is next. It orbits Jupiter at about 671,000 kilometers, farther out than Io, but still well within the most intense portions of Jupiter's radiation belts. Europa is slightly smaller than Earth's moon, with a diameter of roughly 3,122 kilometers. Its surface is covered in water ice, and that ice is some of the smoothest terrain in the solar system. There are very few large craters, which tells scientists that the surface is geologically young, constantly being reworked by processes underneath. Fractures and ridges crisscross the ice in complex patterns that suggest the surface is a dynamic shell, cracking and shifting above something liquid. And what lies underneath is what makes Europa one of the most exciting objects in all of planetary science. There is strong evidence, gathered primarily by the Galileo spacecraft and supported by subsequent observations, that Europa harbours a global ocean of liquid water beneath its ice shell. This ocean may contain roughly 2 to 3 times as much water as all of Earth's oceans combined. The ice shell above it is estimated to be somewhere between 15 and 25 kilometers thick, though some models suggest it could be thinner in certain regions. The water is kept liquid by tidal heating, the same mechanism that drives Io's volcanism, though less intense at Europa's greater distance from Jupiter. This ocean makes Europa a primary target in the search for extraterrestrial life. Where there is liquid water, energy, and the right chemistry, life as we understand it becomes possible. NASA's Europa Clipper mission, which launched in October of 2024 and is scheduled to arrive at Jupiter in April of 2030, is designed specifically to study Europa's ice shell, its ocean, and its potential habitability. It will make 49 close flybys of Europa over a 4-year primary mission, gathering data on the ice thickness, the ocean's chemistry, and the surface geology. But Europa Clipper is a robotic mission. It is not sending humans. And there's a very good reason for that. The radiation environment at Europa is devastating. The surface radiation dose on Europa is approximately 540 rem per day. That is enough to deliver a lethal dose every 18 hours or so. A human standing unprotected on Europa's surface would receive enough radiation to be fatal within a single day. Even inside a heavily shielded habitat, the cumulative exposure over weeks and months would pose extreme health risks. Elevated cancer rates, central nervous system damage, immune suppression, the kind of slow motion destruction that no amount of medical intervention can fully prevent. And the ice surface itself is unstable. There is evidence of regions where the ice crust has fractured, shifted, and refrozen, suggesting geological activity that could make surface construction unreliable. Europa's scientific value is extraordinary. Its potential for harboring life is one of the most compelling questions in all of science, but as a place for humans to live, it is essentially a frozen radiation chamber sitting on top of a shifting ice shelf above a dark ocean. The 2003 NASA conceptual study that considered human missions to the Jupiter system specifically noted that Europa's extreme radiation environment made direct human exploration of that moon impractical. The study proposed instead that humans could operate from a safer location and explore Europa remotely, using teleoperated robots. That safer location was Callisto. Ganymede is the third Galilean moon outward from Jupiter, orbiting at approximately 1,070,000 kilometers. It is the largest moon in the entire solar system, bigger than the planet Mercury, with a diameter of 5,268 kilometers. Ganymede is the only moon known to generate its own magnetic field, a miniature magnetosphere that partially shields its surface from Jupiter's radiation. This magnetic field was confirmed by the Galileo spacecraft and has been studied further by the Juno mission. It creates small auroral zones near Ganymede's poles, similar in principle to Earth's northern and southern lights, though far smaller and weaker. Ganymede also has evidence of a subsurface ocean, possibly sandwiched between layers of ice, deep beneath its surface. The ocean is thought to lie roughly 150 kilometers below the surface. ESA's JUICE mission, the Jupiter Icy Moons Explorer, launched in April of 2023 and is scheduled to arrive at Jupiter in July of 2031. JUICE has Ganymede as its ultimate target and will eventually enter orbit around it in late 2034, becoming the first spacecraft ever to orbit a moon other than Earth's own. Ganymede is scientifically rich, and its magnetic field provides some radiation protection. But some is the critical word. Ganymede's magnetosphere is small and weak compared to Earth's. It deflects a portion of Jupiter's charged particles in certain regions, particularly near the poles, but it does not eliminate the radiation threat across the entire surface. The radiation environment at Ganymede is significantly reduced compared to Europa or Io, particularly within the regions shielded by the magnetic field near the poles, but across much of the surface it remains well above what would be considered acceptable for long-term human habitation without substantial shielding. A settlement on Ganymede would still need heavy radiation protection, and the uneven distribution of that protection across the surface would constrain where habitats could be placed. The surface itself is a mix of two terrain types: older dark regions heavily cratered like Callisto, and younger lighter regions marked by grooves and ridges that suggest past geological activity. Ganymede sits closer to Jupiter than Callisto, meaning it experiences stronger tidal effects and a more complex gravitational and radiation environment. It is a better option than Europa or Io for human presence, but it is not the option that NASA chose when they studied where to send humans in the Jupiter system. That distinction belongs to the outermost Galilean moon. Callisto orbits Jupiter at a distance of approximately 1.88 million kilometers. That is roughly 1.8 times farther from Jupiter than Ganymede, 2.8 times farther than Europa, and 4.5 times farther than Io. And that distance matters enormously, because it places Callisto just outside the main belt of Jupiter's most intense radiation. The charged particle flux at Callisto's surface is approximately 300 times lower than at Europa. The radiation dose on Callisto's surface is estimated at roughly 0.01 rem per day, which is about 10 times higher than Earth's average natural background radiation. That sounds like a lot until you compare it to the other options. Europa delivers roughly 54,000 times more radiation per day than Callisto. Io delivers roughly 360,000 times more. Even low Earth orbit, where astronauts aboard the International Space Station accumulate radiation exposure from cosmic rays and trapped particles in Earth's own Van Allen belts, delivers a comparable or higher dose than Callisto's surface. The surface of Mars, with its thin atmosphere and lack of a global magnetic field, also exposes inhabitants to radiation levels in the same general range. In the context of the Jupiter system, Callisto's radiation environment is remarkably mild. It is not safe by Earth standards, but it is the closest thing to safe that Jupiter's neighborhood offers. Callisto is the second largest moon of Jupiter and the third largest moon in the solar system, after Ganymede and Saturn's moon Titan. Its diameter is approximately 4,821 kilometers. That makes it nearly as large as the planet Mercury, though it has only about a third of Mercury's mass because it is composed of roughly equal parts rock and ice, rather than dense metal and silicate. Its density, about 1.83 grams per cubic centimeter, is the lowest of the Galilean moons, reflecting that mixed composition. Its surface gravity is about 0.126 times Earth's, or roughly 1/8 of what you feel standing on the ground right now. That is somewhat lower than the gravity on Earth's own moon. An object that weighs 100 pounds on Earth would weigh about 12.5 pounds on Callisto. You could jump nearly 8 times higher with the same effort. This low gravity has significant implications for long-term human habitation, but we will come to those implications later tonight. The surface of Callisto is ancient. It is the most heavily cratered object in the solar system, meaning its surface has not been significantly reworked by geological processes for billions of years. There are no active volcanoes, no shifting ice plates, no geysers, no tectonic ridges, no detectable geological activity of any kind. The surface is a frozen record of the bombardment era that shaped the early solar system. The largest impact feature is a multi-ring basin called Valhalla, a structure so large that its outer concentric rings extend to a diameter of roughly 3,800 kilometers, covering a significant fraction of the moon's face. Another large multi-ring structure called Asgard spans roughly 1,600 kilometers. These impact basins have been smoothed over billions of years by the slow, viscous creep of ice, but they are still clearly visible, ancient scars from impacts that occurred when the solar system was young. Callisto's geological stability is, from an engineering perspective, an advantage. If you want to build something on a surface and have it stay where you put it, without worrying about the ground cracking open or shifting beneath your foundations, a geologically dead world is preferable to one that is still active. Callisto has a thin exosphere, an atmosphere so tenuous that the individual molecules of carbon dioxide and possibly molecular oxygen that compose it do not even collide with each other under normal conditions. The surface pressure is approximately 0.75 micropascals. For all practical purposes, this is a vacuum. There is no weather, no wind, no atmospheric protection from micrometeorites or solar ultraviolet radiation. But there is also no corrosive atmosphere to degrade equipment, and the vacuum simplifies certain engineering challenges related to surface operations. Water ice is abundant on the surface, representing roughly 50% of the surface material by mass. Compounds detected spectroscopically include carbon dioxide ice, silicates, and various organic compounds. The presence of water ice is significant for any potential human mission because water is not just drinking water. It is a feedstock for breathable oxygen through electrolysis and a potential source of hydrogen for rocket propellant. The raw material for survival exists on the surface. The question is what it takes to turn that raw material into something a human being can actually use. Data gathered by the Galileo spacecraft in the 1990s indicated that Callisto may harbor a subsurface ocean of salty liquid water, possibly located about 155 miles beneath the surface. This finding was based on measurements of how Callisto's magnetic signature responded to Jupiter's changing magnetic field. A response consistent with a conducting layer beneath the ice, most likely a saltwater ocean. Unlike Europa and Io, Callisto does not participate in the orbital resonance that generates intense tidal heating in the inner moons. It orbits independently, completing one orbit of Jupiter every 16.7 Earth days, tidally locked so that the same hemisphere always faces the giant planet. It has never experienced the kind of internal heating that would fully differentiate its interior into distinct layers the way a planet like Earth has. Models suggest Callisto's interior remains only partially differentiated, a blended mixture of ice and rock that has never fully separated. This makes the possible existence of a subsurface ocean somewhat puzzling, because without strong tidal heating, what keeps the water liquid? The leading hypothesis involves residual heat from formation, combined with antifreeze compounds like ammonia or salts that could lower the melting point of ice, allowing liquid water to persist at depth even without a strong ongoing heat source. The ocean's existence remains a leading hypothesis rather than a confirmed fact, but the evidence has been growing stronger. In 2025, that picture received significant new support. NASA's Juno spacecraft detected Callisto's ultraviolet auroral footprint in Jupiter's polar atmosphere for the first time. This discovery, published in Nature Communications by a team led by researchers from multiple institutions, completed what scientists called the family portrait of Galilean moon auroral footprints. All 4 large moons now have confirmed electromagnetic interactions with Jupiter's magnetosphere. The detection was made possible by unusual conditions. A blast of solar wind shifted Jupiter's bright main auroral oval equatorward, briefly revealing the much fainter footprint of Callisto, which is normally hidden beneath the brighter aurora. The observation showed a double spot structure, characteristic of the footprints produced by the other 3 moons, with a maximum ultraviolet brightness of 137 kilorayleigh. Concurrent measurements within Callisto's magnetic flux tube revealed field-aligned electrons with a characteristic energy of 10 kilo-electron-volts. For Callisto, the detection of this footprint provided new evidence about the moon's internal electrical conductivity, strengthening the case that a subsurface ocean is present. The discovery did not prove the ocean exists beyond all doubt, but it added another independent line of evidence pointing in the same direction. And it confirmed that Callisto's electromagnetic interaction with Jupiter follows the same fundamental physics as the inner 3 moons. This is the moon that NASA's Glenn Research Center and the Ohio Aerospace Institute examined in a 2003 conceptual study called Human Outer Planet Exploration, or HOPE. The study was part of NASA's Revolutionary Aerospace Systems Concepts program, and it asked a specific question. If we wanted to send humans to the Jupiter system, where would we send them and how would we get them there? The answer was Callisto. The study proposed a split mission architecture using nuclear electric propulsion to transport a crew of 6 astronauts on a roughly 5-year round trip. Cargo and propellant tanker vehicles would depart first, establishing infrastructure at Callisto before the crew arrived. The crew would establish a surface base and use it for multiple purposes. Scientific research on Callisto itself, including sampling the ancient surface and studying the moon's interior structure. Teleoperation of robotic probes on Europa, studying that moon's ocean from a location where radiation would not kill the operators. The signal delay between Callisto and Europa is only a few seconds, compared to the 33 to 53-minute delay between Callisto and Earth. This means a human operator on Callisto could control a robotic rover or submersible on Europa in something close to real time, responding to obstacles, adjusting instruments, and making decisions on the timescale of seconds rather than hours. The scientific return from this kind of telepresence would vastly exceed what a fully autonomous robot could achieve, because human judgment and adaptability could be applied to the exploration of Europa's ice and whatever lies beneath it without exposing the human to Europa's lethal radiation. And the base would produce rocket propellant from Callisto's water ice. The process would harvest surface ice, electrolyze the water into hydrogen and oxygen, and liquefy both gases for storage as cryogenic fuel. This would essentially turn Callisto into a refueling depot at the edge of the outer solar system, where spacecraft arriving from the inner planets could fill their tanks before continuing outward to Saturn, the ice giants, or the Kuiper Belt, dramatically extending the reach of exploration without requiring every mission to carry all of its fuel from Earth. The study examined both nuclear electric propulsion using high-power magnetoplasma dynamic thrusters and bimodal nuclear thermal rocket propulsion, and it envisioned cargo missions departing as early as 2041, with the crewed mission following around 2045. The HOPE study was a conceptual exercise, not a funded mission plan. No hardware was built, no crew was selected, no launch date was committed to, but it represented a serious, multi-center NASA effort to think through what a human presence in the Jupiter system might look like, and Callisto was the clear and deliberate choice. 2 major robotic missions are now headed toward the Jupiter system that will tell us far more about Callisto than we currently know. ESA's JUICE mission launched in April of 2023 and is currently making its way through the inner solar system, using gravity assist from Venus and Earth to build the momentum needed to reach Jupiter. Its arrival is planned for July of 2031. After entering the Jovian system, JUICE will conduct multiple flybys of Callisto between 2032 and 2033, gathering detailed data on the moon's surface composition, ice thickness, magnetic properties, and possible subsurface ocean before eventually entering orbit around Ganymede. NASA's Europa Clipper, launched in October of 2024, will arrive at Jupiter in April of 2030. While its primary focus is Europa, the mission will also use Callisto and Ganymede for gravity assists during its operational phase. Together, these missions will provide the most detailed picture of Callisto that science has ever assembled. They may confirm or challenge the subsurface ocean hypothesis. They may reveal surface features relevant to future landing sites. They will certainly refine our understanding of what any future human mission to Callisto would encounter. So here is where things stand. Among the 4 large moons of Jupiter, Callisto has the lowest radiation, the most stable surface, abundant water ice, and a position outside the worst of Jupiter's magnetosphere. It has been specifically identified by NASA as the most promising location for a human outpost in the Jupiter system. It may harbor a subsurface ocean. It could serve as a way station for missions deeper into the outer solar system. It has real scientific value, both for studying the Jupiter system and for understanding the conditions that might support life beyond Earth. All of that is true. None of it is exaggerated. Callisto is by a significant margin the least hostile of the Galilean moons for human beings. And now we need to talk about what that actually means, because the phrase least hostile is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. It does not mean safe. It does not mean comfortable. It does not mean anything remotely resembling the conditions under which human beings evolved and to which our bodies and minds are adapted. It means that compared to a world where you would die of radiation in hours, and a world where you would die of radiation in a day, and a world where you would be consumed by volcanic activity while being irradiated, Callisto is the one where the environment merely tries to kill you through cold, vacuum, isolation, and the slow grinding failure of every machine that stands between you and the void outside the walls. Callisto's reputation as the safe moon of Jupiter is not wrong exactly. It is dangerously incomplete It tells you where Callisto stands relative to its neighbors. It does not tell you where it stands relative to anywhere a human being has ever actually lived. The distance between least deadly option near Jupiter and a place where humans could survive is vast. And that distance is filled with engineering challenges, biological constraints, logistical impossibilities, and operational pressures that no conceptual study has fully resolved. Because no conceptual study can fully resolve them without actually sending people there and discovering in real time and real cold and real vacuum what it takes to keep a human body alive on a world that was never built for one. That is what the rest of this story is about. Not why Callisto is better than Europa. That part is clear. The rest of this story is about what you would actually face if you stepped out of a lander onto Callisto's ancient, cratered, frozen surface and tried to stay alive. What you would breathe, what you would drink, how you would stay warm, where your power would come from, what happens when something breaks, and why the answers to every single one of those questions lead back to the same unsettling reality. You are not living on Callisto. You are living inside a machine on Callisto. And if that machine stops working, even for a day, there is no door you can open to step outside and wait for help. Because outside is minus 138 degrees, there is no air, and the nearest human being who is not already inside your habitat with you is 500 million miles away. Let's start with the cold. Not as a statistic, as a physical reality that would define every moment of every day for anyone trying to survive on Callisto's surface. The average surface temperature on Callisto is approximately minus 138 degrees Celsius. That is roughly minus 218 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 134 Kelvin. Those numbers are easy to read and difficult to internalize, so let's try to build a sense of what they actually mean. The coldest temperature ever reliably recorded on the surface of Earth was at the Soviet research station Vostok in Antarctica on July 21st, 1983. The instruments measured minus 89.2 degrees Celsius. That is cold enough to freeze carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Cold enough that exposed human skin develops frostbite in under a minute. Cold enough that steel becomes brittle and can shatter on impact. Cold enough that the researchers at Vostok had to take extraordinary precautions simply to walk between heated buildings. The winter crews at those stations live inside sealed, insulated structures with dedicated heating systems, and even then, they describe the experience as one of the harshest environments humans have ever voluntarily endured. Callisto is approximately 50 degrees Celsius colder than that. At minus 138 degrees Celsius, the cold is not merely dangerous, it is an active, aggressive force that attacks every exposed surface, every seal, every joint, every piece of equipment that separates the interior of a habitat from the outside. Metal contracts, polymers become rigid and brittle, lubricants solidify, thermal gradients between the heated interior and the frozen exterior create stresses that accumulate over time, working at every connection point, every weld, every gasket. On Earth, engineers design for temperature ranges of perhaps 80 to 100 degrees between seasonal extremes in the harshest climates. On Callisto, the temperature difference between the inside of a heated habitat and the outside surface would be more than 150 degrees Celsius, maintained continuously every hour of every day for years. Every watt of heat generated inside the habitat is trying to escape. thermal energy flows from hot to cold, and the cold outside Callisto's walls is relentless. The habitat must be insulated to a degree that far exceeds anything built on Earth. Multi-layered vacuum insulation panels, radiation barriers, thermal breaks at every structural connection point. And even with all of that, heat loss is constant. The heating system has to run without interruption, not like a furnace in a house that cycles on and off with a thermostat. Continuously. Because if it stops, the interior temperature begins to drop immediately. And in an environment where the outside temperature is 138 degrees below zero, the rate of cooling once the heaters stop is measured in hours before the habitat becomes dangerously cold, and in days before water lines freeze, equipment fails, and the space becomes uninhabitable. A heating failure on Callisto is not a discomfort, it is a countdown. Now consider the air, or rather the complete absence of it. Callisto's exosphere, the thin haze of molecules that technically qualifies as an atmosphere, has a surface pressure of approximately 0.75 micropascals. That is not a low pressure atmosphere. That is not a thin atmosphere. That is, for all biological and engineering purposes, a vacuum. For comparison, Earth's atmosphere at sea level exerts a pressure of approximately 101,325 pascals. Callisto's surface pressure is roughly 135 billion times lower than Earth's. The molecules in Callisto's exosphere, mostly carbon dioxide with some possible molecular oxygen, are so sparse that they travel in straight lines between the surface and space without colliding with each other. This is not an atmosphere in any sense that a human body can interact with. You cannot breathe it. You cannot even detect it without sensitive instruments. A human being placed on Callisto's surface without a pressure suit would lose consciousness in roughly 10 to 15 seconds, as the oxygen in their blood was no longer held in solution by the surrounding pressure. Death would follow within a minute or two. This is not speculation. It is the well-understood physics of how the human body responds to hard vacuum, documented through accident reports, decompression chamber studies, and aerospace medicine research. The lungs cannot function without external pressure. The body's fluids begin to evaporate at extremely low pressures. The transition from alive to dead is fast, and is not survivable without immediate intervention. This means every molecule of breathable air on Callisto has to be manufactured. There is no natural source of oxygen in any usable quantity. The trace molecular oxygen in the exosphere is a product of ultraviolet radiation, breaking apart water ice and carbon dioxide on the surface, and it is far too diffuse to collect. The oxygen that people would breathe inside a Callisto habitat would come from splitting water molecules through electrolysis, running an electric current through liquid water to separate it into hydrogen and oxygen gas. The water comes from the ice on the surface, which must be mined, transported into the habitat, melted, filtered, and fed into the electrolysis systems. The electricity to drive the electrolysis comes from the habitat's power plant, which, as we will discuss shortly, has to be nuclear. Every breath a person takes on Callisto traces back through a chain of engineered processes. Ice to water, water to oxygen, electricity to chemistry, reactor to life. But oxygen alone does not make air breathable. The habitat's atmosphere also needs nitrogen as a buffer gas to dilute the oxygen to safe concentrations. Pure oxygen at normal atmospheric pressure is dangerously flammable and can cause oxygen toxicity with prolonged exposure. Earth's atmosphere is roughly 78% nitrogen and 21% oxygen. A Callisto habitat would need to maintain a similar ratio, and nitrogen is not something Callisto is known to have in abundance on its surface. It might need to be brought from Earth in compressed or liquefied form as part of the initial mission supplies, representing a significant mass cost at launch. Once inside the habitat, the nitrogen would be recycled continuously, but any losses through airlock cycling, small leaks, or chemical reactions would slowly deplete the supply with no local source to replenish it. Carbon dioxide management is equally critical. Humans exhale carbon dioxide with every breath. In a sealed habitat, carbon dioxide accumulates. At concentrations above about 1%, people begin to experience headaches, dizziness, and impaired cognitive function. Above 5%, it becomes immediately dangerous. Above about 10%, it can be lethal. The habitat needs scrubbing systems that continuously remove carbon dioxide from the air. On the International Space Station, this is done using chemical sorbent beds and a system called the Carbon Dioxide Removal Assembly, which captures carbon dioxide from the cabin air and vents it overboard into space. A Callisto habitat would need similar technology, but ideally it would not vent the carbon dioxide. It would recycle it. A Sabatier reactor can combine carbon dioxide with hydrogen to produce methane and water, recovering the water for reuse and the oxygen it contains. Closing the loop on carbon dioxide means less water ice needs to be mined, less electrolysis needs to be performed, and less waste accumulates. But these recycling systems are complex. They require maintenance, and every component in the chain is a potential point of failure. If the carbon dioxide scrubbers stop working, the air inside the habitat becomes toxic within hours, not days, hours. The margin for error in life support on Callisto is not measured in comfortable intervals. It is measured in the time it takes for chemistry to overwhelm biology. Then there is pressure. The habitat walls do not just keep the cold out, they hold the air in. Inside, the atmosphere is pressurized to somewhere near Earth normal, around 100 kilopascals. Outside, the pressure is essentially zero. That means every square meter of wall, ceiling, and floor is bearing an outward force of approximately 10,000 kilograms, the equivalent of about 10 metric tons pressing outward on every square meter of surface. The habitat is, structurally, a pressure vessel. Like a submarine, but in reverse, a submarine holds the water out. A Callisto habitat holds the air in. And like a submarine, every penetration of the hull, every window, every airlock door, every pipe or cable that passes through the wall is a potential failure point. A crack in the hull, a failed seal on an airlock, a manufacturing defect in a viewport panel, any of these could lead to depressurization. The air inside rushes out into the vacuum. The pressure drops. If the breach is small, automated systems might detect the pressure loss and seal the affected section before the situation becomes critical. If the breach is large, the people in that section have seconds, not minutes. Seconds. The physics of decompression in hard vacuum is not forgiving. There is no gradual warning, no slow decline in air quality. There is a rupture, a rush of escaping air, and then silence. Building a structure that can maintain pressure integrity for years in an environment where the outside temperature is minus 138 degrees, and the thermal cycling from habitat heating creates constant stress on joints and seals, is an engineering challenge that goes beyond anything currently built for space applications. The International Space Station is pressurized, but it operates in the relatively benign thermal environment of low Earth orbit, where temperature swings are significant but manageable, and is regularly resupplied with replacement seals, components, and materials from Earth. A Callisto habitat would have to maintain pressure integrity for years between resupply opportunities that take years to arrive, using seals and structural components that are constantly stressed by thermal gradients, using materials whose long-term behavior in combined vacuum and extreme cold is not fully characterized because no one has ever built a permanent pressurized structure in those conditions. Water is the next link in the chain. It appears to be the easiest problem to solve on Callisto, because water ice is everywhere. Roughly 50% of the surface material by mass is water ice. The raw ingredient is abundant, but the gap between raw ice on a frozen surface and clean, usable water inside a habitat is filled with engineering. The ice has to be extracted. On Callisto, this means mining, cutting or drilling into the surface ice, loading it into containers, and transporting it to the habitat. This requires machinery, excavators, drills, transport vehicles, all of which must operate in Callisto's surface, cold and hard vacuum. Moving parts in those conditions are a nightmare. Lubricants do not behave normally. Metal components are under constant thermal stress. Electrical systems must be hardened against the cold. Every piece of mining equipment requires power, maintenance, and eventually replacement parts that cannot be ordered from Earth. Once inside the habitat, the raw ice must be melted and purified. Callisto's surface ice is not pure water. Spectroscopic analysis has detected carbon dioxide ice, silicates, sulfur dioxide, and various organic compounds mixed in with the water ice. These contaminants have to be removed before the water can be used for drinking, food production, or electrolysis. Filtration and distillation systems handle this, but they require energy and they produce waste that has to be managed. The purified water then enters the habitat's water cycle, used for drinking, cooking, hygiene, food production, and industrial processes. Used water is collected, filtered, recycled, and returned to the supply. The International Space Station already does this, recovering more than 90% of water from a crew urine and cabin humidity. A Callisto habitat would need to push that recovery rate even higher, as close to 100% as possible, because every litre of water that is lost from the cycle is a litre that has to be replaced by mining more ice, transporting it, melting it, and purifying it. Over years of operation, even small losses compound. A system that loses 1% of its water per cycle sounds efficient until you calculate what 1% per cycle means over 5 years of continuous operation. The water system is not a convenience, it is a survival loop that has to close almost perfectly and stay closed. Food is perhaps the most viscerally challenging a requirement, because it forces you to confront just how far removed life on Callisto would be from anything recognizable as normal. Nothing grows on Callisto. The surface is ice and rock and ancient crater dust. There is no soil. There are no nutrients in any accessible form. There is no meaningful sunlight. At Jupiter's average distance of 5.2 astronomical units from the Sun, the sunlight that reaches the Jovian system is roughly 4% of what reaches Earth. 4%. On Earth, at noon on a clear day near the equator, the solar irradiance is approximately 1,360 watts per square meter. At Jupiter's distance, that drops to roughly 50 watts per square meter. That is less light than a deeply overcast winter afternoon in northern Europe. It is not enough to power serious photosynthetic food production through solar collection alone. Greenhouses with transparent walls letting in natural sunlight, the kind you might imagine on Mars where solar irradiance is still roughly 43% of Earth's, are not viable on Callisto. The light is simply too weak. Every crop grown on Callisto would be grown indoors, under artificial lighting, powered by electricity from nuclear reactors. Hydroponic or aeroponic systems would allow plants to grow without soil, their roots suspended in nutrient-rich water or mist. LED grow lights tuned to the specific wavelengths that plants use for photosynthesis, primarily red and blue light, could provide the energy for growth with reasonable electrical efficiency. The International Space Station has demonstrated small-scale plant growth using exactly these techniques. Astronauts have grown lettuce, radishes, and chili peppers in the veggie and advanced plant habitat systems on the station. The results have been promising for small supplements to the crew's diet. But feeding a permanent crew of 6 or more people entirely from indoor agriculture is a categorically different challenge from growing a few heads of lettuce as a morale-boosting supplement. A single person requires roughly 2,000 calories per day. That means the habitat's agricultural system would need to produce enough food to supply at minimum 12,000 calories per day for a crew of 6 every day for years. The growing area would need to be substantial, probably hundreds of square meters of active cultivation, with multiple crop cycles staggered so that something is always being harvested. The crops would need to provide a balanced nutritional profile, not just calories, but protein, fats, vitamins, and minerals. Staple crops like wheat, soybeans, potatoes, sweet potatoes, and leafy greens would likely form the foundation, chosen for their caloric density, nutritional value, and proven performance in controlled environment agriculture. Variety would be limited. The crew would eat the same rotation of meals, prepared from the same small set of ingredients, for years. The psychological impact of dietary monotony is well documented in studies of Antarctic expedition crews and submarine deployments, and it is not trivial. But even a well-designed hydroponic system requires careful management. Nutrient solutions must be monitored and adjusted. Plant diseases and pest infestations can occur even in sealed environments. Lighting systems draw significant power, and any major crop failure, whether from equipment malfunction, contamination, or an unexpected plant pathogen, would be a survival crisis. There is no grocery store on Callisto. There is no emergency food shipment arriving next week. If the food system fails, the crew rations whatever they have stored. They try to repair the system, and they hope they succeed before the supplies run out. Gravity, or rather the near absence of it, adds another layer of physiological challenge that compounds every other problem. Callisto's surface gravity is 0.126 times Earth's. If you weigh 180 pounds on Earth, you weigh roughly 23 pounds on Callisto. You could jump over a single-story building with a running start. Objects fall in slow motion. Pouring liquid from one container to another behaves differently. The experience of moving through space is fundamentally altered by gravity this low, but the effects on the human body are not recreational. They are medical. On Earth, gravity provides a constant load on the skeletal and muscular systems. Bones stay dense because they bear weight. Muscles stay strong because they work against gravity with every step. The cardiovascular system maintains its tone because the heart has to pump blood upward against gravitational pull. Remove that load, and the body begins to adapt in ways that are harmful over time. In microgravity, astronauts lose roughly 1 to 2% of their bone mineral density per month, particularly in the load-bearing bones of the hips, spine, and legs. Muscle mass decreases. The heart, no longer working as hard, begins to atrophy slightly. Fluids redistribute upward, causing facial puffiness, increased intracranial pressure, and changes in vision that can become permanent. Astronauts returning from 6-month stays on the International Space Station require weeks of rehabilitation to readjust to Earth's gravity. Callisto's gravity is not zero, but it is so low that the protective loading effect is minimal. At 1/8 of Earth's gravity, bones and muscles receive a fraction of the stimulus they need to maintain density and strength. Over months and years, the crew would likely experience bone loss, muscle atrophy, and cardiovascular deconditioning qualitatively similar to what astronauts experience in microgravity. Perhaps somewhat reduced in severity, but far from negligible. Exercise countermeasures, resistance training, and cardiovascular workouts designed to simulate higher gravitational loads would be essential. The crew would need to spend significant portions of each day exercising, not for fitness or recreation, but for medical survival. Skip the exercise protocol for long enough, and your body deteriorates to the point where returning to Earth, if that were ever an option, might be physically impossible. The implications for children are even more uncertain. No human being has ever been conceived, gestated, or born in low gravity. We have no data on how fetal development proceeds when the constant gravitational loading that has shaped mammalian development for hundreds of millions of years is reduced to 1/8 of its normal value. Would bones form correctly? Would the cardiovascular system develop the strength needed to function in higher gravity? Would the vestibular system, the inner ear structures that provide balance and spatial orientation, calibrate properly? These are open questions. A child born and raised on Callisto might be physiologically adapted to Callisto's gravity and unable to tolerate Earth's. They would be, in a very real biological sense, Callistoan rather than Earthling, not by choice, by circumstance. The gravity problem is not something that can be fully engineered away with exercise equipment. It is a fundamental constraint imposed by the world itself. And all of this, every system described so far, the heating, the air production, the carbon dioxide scrubbing, the pressure containment, the water mining and recycling, the food production, the medical countermeasures for low gravity, all of it runs on power. Without power, nothing works. The heaters stop. The air systems shut down. The water freezes. The lights go out. The food stops growing. The habitat becomes a sealed metal box cooling toward the ambient lethal cold in the dark. Power is not one system among many on Callisto. It is the system that all other systems depend on. It is the foundation beneath the foundation. Solar panels, the workhorse of power generation on the International Space Station and on Mars rovers, are nearly useless at Jupiter's distance from the Sun. At 5.2 astronomical units, the available solar energy is reduced to roughly 4% of what Earth receives. The solar panels that power the International Space Station generate about 120 kilowatts in Earth orbit. The same panels at Jupiter's distance would generate less than 5 kilowatts. That is not enough to power a serious habitat. You could cover the entire surface around the habitat with solar panels, and still not generate the power needed to run the heating, air, water, food, and lighting systems for even a small crew. Solar power is not the answer at Callisto. The sun is too far away and too faint. The only credible power source for a Callisto habitat is nuclear fission. A compact nuclear reactor, similar in principle to the reactors that power submarines and aircraft carriers, but designed for the specific demands of a planetary surface, would generate the electricity and heat needed to keep the habitat alive. NASA has been developing small fission power systems for surface applications under programs like Kilopower, which demonstrated a prototype reactor capable of generating roughly 1 to 10 kilowatts of electrical power from a uranium reactor core about the size of a paper towel roll. A Callisto habitat would likely need significantly more than that. Perhaps hundreds of kilowatts or even megawatts of combined electrical and thermal power to run all of its systems simultaneously with adequate margin for peak demand periods and equipment cycling. The reactor would need to operate continuously for years, not months, years, without scheduled shutdowns for maintenance, because shutting down the reactor means shutting down everything it powers. Multiple reactors would be needed for redundancy. If one reactor fails, the others must carry the full load while repairs are attempted. If all reactors fail simultaneously, the habitat has only its stored battery power to sustain life support, and battery reserves measured in hours or days are the only buffer between a functioning habitat and a catastrophe. The reactors also generate waste heat that must be rejected. On Earth, power plants dump waste heat into rivers, lakes, or the atmosphere. On Callisto, there is no air and no water outside the habitat. Waste heat must be radiated into space using large radiator panels that emit infrared energy. These radiators are exposed to the surface environment, to the cold, the vacuum, the micrometeorite flux, and any dust or debris that accumulates over time. They must be maintained and eventually repaired or replaced. The nuclear fuel itself has a finite supply. Uranium fuel rods have a service life measured in years to decades, depending on the reactor design and power output. Replacement fuel must either be carried from Earth, representing enormous mass and cost at launch, or manufactured from local materials, which on Callisto would be extraordinarily challenging, given the absence of accessible uranium ore on an ice and rock surface. The most likely approach is to bring enough fuel for the planned mission duration with substantial reserves, and to design the reactor for maximum fuel efficiency and minimum maintenance requirements. But no matter how the problem is approached, the reactor is the heart of the habitat. If it stops beating, everything else stops with it. Every system we have discussed so far, heating, air, pressure, water, food, gravity countermeasures, and power, is a machine. And machines need maintenance. They need spare parts. They need people who understand how they work, not just in theory, but in practice, who can diagnose a malfunction, improvise a repair, and keep the system running when the manual does not quite cover what is actually happening. Every one of these systems must operate continuously, simultaneously, for years, in an environment that aggressively degrades materials, stresses structures, and offers no natural backup of any kind. There is no opening a window for fresh air. There is no stepping outside to get warm in the sunlight. There is no backup water supply flowing in a stream nearby. Every resource consumed inside the habitat was either brought from Earth at enormous cost or manufactured on the spot using energy from a nuclear reactor, equipment that was also brought from Earth, and raw materials that were mined from a frozen surface at minus 138 degrees. This is what people mean when they say Callisto is the safe moon. This is what safe looks like near Jupiter. A sealed, pressurized, heated, artificially lit, nuclear-powered life support capsule bolted to the surface of a frozen world where every molecule of air, every drop of water, every calorie of food, and every degree of warmth above the ambient lethal cold is the product of machines that humans built, carried across 500 million miles of space, assembled on an airless surface, and must now keep running without failure, without resupply, and without any external assistance for as long as anyone intends to remain alive. And everything described to this point assumes that those machines work, that the reactors keep running, that the seals hold, that the air scrubbers do not clog, that the water filtration membranes do not degrade, that the crops do not fail, that nothing breaks in a way that cannot be repaired with the tools and materials on hand. It assumes, in other words, that everything goes according to plan. But Callisto does not care about plans. And the thing that makes every one of these challenges worse, the thing that turns a difficult engineering problem into a potential existential crisis, is not any single system failure. It is the distance. The unimaginable, unbridgeable, operationally devastating distance between Callisto and any source of help. That is where this story goes next. The distance between Earth and Callisto is not a number. It is a condition. It shapes every decision, constrains every plan, and eliminates every assumption that comes naturally to people who have spent their entire lives on a planet where help is never more than a phone call and a few hours away. To understand what living on Callisto would actually demand, you have to understand what it means to be almost 500 million miles from the nearest civilization, the nearest hospital, the nearest spare parts warehouse, the nearest human being who is not already sealed inside the same habitat as you. Jupiter orbits the Sun at an average distance of approximately 484 million miles, or about 778 million kilometers. That is 5.2 times the distance from the Earth to the Sun. Callisto orbits Jupiter, so its distance from Earth changes continuously depending on where both planets are in their respective orbits. At closest approach, when Earth and Jupiter are on the same side of the Sun, the distance is roughly 365 million miles. At their farthest, when the two planets are on opposite sides of the Sun, the distance stretches to roughly 600 million miles. The average, the number most commonly used in mission planning, is around 484 million miles. These are distances that have no intuitive meaning to the human mind. They are too large to visualize, too abstract to feel, but they have very concrete, very tangible consequences for anyone trying to live at the far end of them. The first consequence is the journey itself. Getting to Callisto is not like getting to Mars. Mars, at its closest, is roughly 34 million miles from Earth. With current propulsion technology and favorable orbital alignments, a one-way trip to Mars takes roughly 7 to 9 months. That is a long time in a spacecraft, but it is within the range of what humans have endured on the International Space Station. Jupiter is roughly 10 to 15 times farther away than Mars, and the journey time scales accordingly. NASA's Galileo spacecraft, launched in 1989, took 6 years to reach Jupiter, though much of that time was spent on a circuitous route through the inner solar system to gain speed through gravity assists from Venus and Earth. The Juno spacecraft, launched in 2011, reached Jupiter in about 5 years, using a more direct trajectory with a single Earth gravity assist. New Horizons, the fastest spacecraft ever to leave Earth orbit at the time of its launch, past Jupiter's distance in roughly 13 months. But it was not trying to stop. It used Jupiter's gravity to accelerate toward Pluto and flew past at enormous speed, stopping at Jupiter, entering orbit, and then descending to Callisto's surface requires a spacecraft that can both accelerate and decelerate, which demands far more fuel and time than a simple flyby. The NASA HOPE study envisioned a round-trip mission to Callisto, lasting approximately 5 years total, using nuclear electric propulsion. That means roughly 2 to 2.5 years of transit in each direction, with a stay at Callisto measured in months. For a crew of 6 astronauts, this means spending years in a spacecraft before ever setting foot on Callisto, followed by months on the surface, followed by years in a spacecraft returning home. The total mission duration approaches the length of some people's entire professional careers. And this is not a leisurely cruise. The transit phase involves its own set of survival challenges: cosmic radiation exposure, psychological isolation, equipment maintenance, medical self-sufficiency, and the knowledge that with every passing month, the distance to any help on Earth is growing. The crew watches Earth shrink in the rear cameras during the first weeks and months. It goes from a recognizable blue disk to a bright point of light, to something indistinguishable from the background stars. There is a moment, different for each person, when the emotional reality of the departure catches up with the intellectual decision they made years earlier. Earth is gone, not temporarily, not the way a traveler's home country recedes on a long flight. Gone in a way that has no precedent in human experience, because the distance is not just vast but growing, and the option to turn around has long since closed. The spacecraft passed a point of no return months ago, the point at which the remaining fuel is committed to the Jupiter trajectory, and there is not enough propellant to reverse course. From that moment forward, the only destination is Callisto. The only way home is through Jupiter's gravity well, through the surface mission, through the return launch, and back across the same void they are crossing now. Every system aboard the transit vehicle must function for years before the crew even arrives. The life support, the radiation shielding, the food and water systems, the power plant, all of it is running during transit, accumulating wear, consuming consumables, demanding the same maintenance attention that the surface habitat will later require. The mission does not begin when the crew lands on Callisto. The mission begins when the spacecraft leaves Earth orbit, and by the time Callisto's cratered surface fills the forward cameras, the crew has already spent years surviving inside a machine. The surface phase is not the start of their isolation. It is the deepening of an isolation that began the moment the engines fired. By the time the crew reaches Callisto, they have already been farther from home and more isolated than any human beings in history. And once they arrive, the isolation does not improve. It intensifies, because now the communication delay becomes the dominant constraint on everything they do. Radio signals travel at the speed of light, roughly 186,000 miles per second. That is fast enough to circle the Earth more than 7 times in a single second. But even at that speed, crossing the gulf between Earth and Jupiter takes time. At Jupiter's average distance from Earth, a radio signal takes approximately 33 to 53 minutes to make the one-way trip, depending on where the two planets are in their orbits. That means a message sent from Callisto to Earth arrives somewhere between 33 and 53 minutes later. If Mission Control on Earth reads the message and immediately sends a reply, That reply arrives back at Callisto another 33 to 53 minutes after that. The shortest possible round-trip communication time is over an hour. The longest is nearly 2 hours. Think about what that means in practice. Imagine a scenario. A pressure seal on one of the habitat modules begins to fail. Sensors detect a slow drop in atmospheric pressure. The crew identifies the affected module and begins troubleshooting. They find the failing seal, assess the damage, and realize they need guidance from Earth's engineering team on the correct repair procedure for this specific seal type. Because the failure mode does not match anything in their onboard maintenance database. They compose a detailed message describing the situation, the seal type, the failure characteristics, the available materials and tools, and transmit it to Earth. Then they wait. 45 minutes later, the message arrives at Mission Control. The engineering team reviews the data, consults the original manufacturer's specifications, runs simulations, and formulates a repair procedure. They transmit the response. 45 minutes later, the crew receives it. Total elapsed time from the moment they sent the message to the moment they received the answer, approximately an hour and a half. During that entire hour and a half, the seal has been leaking. The pressure has been dropping. The crew has been making decisions based on their own judgment, their own training, their own understanding of the systems, because waiting for Earth's input is not compatible with the pace at which the situation is developing. Now imagine the situation is more urgent. A reactor coolant line ruptures. The crew has minutes, not hours. They send a message to Earth, but by the time the message arrives, the situation has already been resolved, or it has already become a catastrophe. Earth's response, when it arrives an hour and a half later, is either a confirmation of what the crew already did, or advice for a situation that no longer exists. In emergencies, the communication delay does not merely slow the response, it eliminates Earth from the decision loop entirely. The crew is on its own. Every critical choice, every repair, every triage decision, every call about whether to evacuate a module or attempt an in-place fix, all of it falls to the people inside the habitat. They cannot phone home and ask for instructions. They cannot consult a specialist in real time. They have whatever knowledge, tools, and materials are already on Callisto, and they have each other. That is the entire resource pool. There is nothing else. This is a fundamentally different operational reality from any human space mission in history. The International Space Station operates in low Earth orbit, with a communication delay of roughly 1 second. The station is in continuous contact with multiple ground control centers. Problems are diagnosed collaboratively between the crew and teams of engineers on the ground. When systems fail, Mission Control can see the telemetry, walk the crew through repair procedures, and make decisions in near real time. Even the Apollo missions to the moon, the most distant crewed missions ever flown, operated with a communication delay of only about 1.3 seconds each way. The crews could have genuine conversations with Houston. Questions and answers flowed back and forth with barely a pause. The famous exchange during Apollo 13, when the crew reported a catastrophic failure and ground teams worked through the night to develop survival procedures, was possible because the communication delay was negligible. Houston could hear the problem as it happened and respond in seconds. On Callisto, there is no Houston in any practical sense. There are people on Earth who care, who have expertise, who would work around the clock to help. but they are separated from the crew by a gap that light itself takes the better part of an hour to cross. Their help arrives in the form of delayed messages, suggestions composed in response to situations that may have changed dramatically by the time the crew reads them. It is communication of a kind, but it is not collaboration. It is not partnership. It is correspondence. Letters crossing an abyss, each one describing a world that has already moved on by the time it is read. The supply chain problem is just as severe, and in some ways more so, because it operates on an even longer timescale. Consider what happens when a critical component fails. Not a pressure seal, which might be repairable with available materials, but something more fundamental. An electrolysis cell in the oxygen production system cracks and cannot be patched. A circuit board in the reactor control system fails due to cumulative radiation damage. A bearing in the water reclamation centrifuge seizes after years of continuous operation. These are not exotic failure modes. They are the normal, expected consequences of operating complex machinery for years in an extreme environment. Every machine has components with finite service lives. Eventually things wear out. On Earth, you order a replacement. It arrives in days, maybe weeks. On the International Space Station, you request a resupply mission. A cargo spacecraft launches from Earth and arrives at the station within hours to a few days. On Mars, a resupply mission takes months, perhaps 7 to 9 months with current technology, which is difficult but conceivable for planning purposes. On Callisto, a resupply mission from Earth takes years, 2 to 3 years at minimum, with advanced propulsion. And that assumes the mission was already being prepared before the failure occurred. If the crew discovers a critical component has failed and requests a replacement from Earth, the request takes at least half an hour to arrive. Earth then has to manufacture or locate the part, load it onto a spacecraft, launch it, and send it on a multi-year trajectory to Jupiter. The replacement arrives optimistically 3 to 4 years after the failure was reported. If the component is one the crew cannot function without, they do not have 3 to 4 years to wait. This means the habitat must carry a deep inventory of spare parts for every critical system. Not just one backup of each component, but multiple backups, because the failure of one part may cause stress on adjacent components, leading to secondary failures. Beyond spare parts, the habitat needs raw materials and fabrication equipment capable of manufacturing replacement components when the spares run out. A machine shop, 3-dimensional printers, metal stock, polymer feedstock, electronic components, wiring, sealant compounds, fasteners of every specification, the tools to make tools, and the people who know how to use all of it, not as a hobby or a specialty, but as a core survival skill practiced and maintained for the duration of the mission. The weight of all of this, the spare parts, the raw materials, the fabrication equipment, has to be launched from Earth. Every kilogram added to the mission payload requires additional propellant to accelerate and decelerate. Every kilogram of propellant requires structural mass to contain it. The mass budget spirals. Mission planners face agonizing trade-offs. Bring more spares and the vehicle is heavier, requiring more fuel, a larger reactor, and a longer acceleration phase. Bring fewer spares and the crew is more vulnerable to failures they cannot repair. There was no comfortable middle ground. Every choice sacrifices something, and the consequences of choosing wrong play out years later, millions of miles from any possibility of correction. Medical isolation is perhaps the most emotionally visceral aspect of the distance problem, because it involves not abstract machinery, but human bodies and human suffering. The crew of a Callisto mission is the most remote medical facility in history. The nearest hospital is not in the next town. It is not on the next continent. It is not even on the next planet. It is on Earth, separated from the patient by years of travel and an hour of communication delay. The crew includes medical personnel, trained in emergency medicine, surgery, dentistry, and whatever specialized fields the mission planners could fit into the training schedule. The habitat includes a medical bay, stocked with surgical instruments, diagnostic equipment, pharmaceutical supplies, and reference databases. But the scope of medical care that 6 to 10 people can provide, no matter how well trained, is inherently limited by the breadth of conditions that can arise and the depth of expertise that any small group can maintain. Consider a scenario. A crew member develops acute appendicitis. On Earth, this is a routine surgical problem. A patient goes to a hospital, a surgeon performs an appendectomy, the patient recovers in a few days. On the International Space Station, this would be a serious situation but manageable because the station can communicate with surgical specialists on the ground in real time, and, in an extreme case, the astronaut could be evacuated to Earth within hours aboard a Soyuz capsule. On Callisto, there is no evacuation. The crew's medical officer performs the surgery using whatever equipment and training they have. If the surgery goes well, the patient recovers. If there are complications, a secondary infection, unexpected bleeding, an adverse reaction to anesthesia, the medical officer handles them, or they go unhandled. There is no calling in a specialist. There is no transferring the patient to a better equipped facility. The medical bay on Callisto is the best equipped facility. It is also the only one. Pharmaceutical supplies present their own challenge. Many medications have shelf lives, typically 2 to 5 years before their potency begins to degrade. A mission that lasts 5 or more years will see some of its drug supplies lose effectiveness over the course of the mission, precisely when they are most likely to be needed. Some medications can be synthesized from precursor chemicals if the habitat has the right equipment and expertise. But pharmaceutical manufacturing aboard a remote habitat is a far cry from the controlled environments of Earth-based drug production. Diagnostic imaging equipment, if it can be carried at all given the mass constraints, requires calibration and maintenance. Without access to the full range of diagnostics that a modern hospital provides, some conditions will go undetected until they become emergencies, and some emergencies will be beyond the crew's ability to treat. And it is not just acute medical events. Over a mission lasting years, the crew will age. They will develop the chronic conditions that come with aging, joint pain, vision changes, cardiovascular issues, the early stages of conditions that on Earth would be managed with specialist care and advanced pharmaceuticals. They will accumulate radiation exposure despite Callisto's relatively mild radiation environment, because even the low background dose compounds over years. They will experience the physiological effects of living in 1/8 gravity, the bone loss and muscle atrophy we discussed earlier, which create their own cascade of medical risks, stress fractures, kidney stones from calcium mobilization, and cardiovascular deconditioning. The medical demands of a long-duration Callisto mission are not limited to emergencies. They are chronic, cumulative, and increasingly complex as the mission extends. Jupiter itself, the reason anyone comes to this part of the solar system in the first place, adds its own operational complications. Jupiter is the most massive planet in the solar system, with a gravitational pull that shapes the orbits of everything near it. Getting into and out of the Jovian system requires careful trajectory planning. Entering orbit around Jupiter demands a significant braking maneuver, burning propellant to slow the spacecraft enough for Jupiter's gravity to capture it, rather than flinging it back into interplanetary space. Once in the Jovian system, navigating between Jupiter's moons requires precise orbital mechanics. The gravitational influence of Jupiter, and to a lesser extent the other large moons, creates a dynamic environment where orbits must be carefully managed. A spacecraft moving from Callisto's orbit to a closer moon, or from Callisto orbit to an escape trajectory back to Earth, needs fuel, time, and accurate navigation. Jupiter's magnetosphere, while less threatening at Callisto's distance than at Europa's, is not negligible. Callisto orbits just outside the main radiation belt, but it does not orbit in a radiation-free zone. The charged particle environment at Callisto's distance still contributes a low but continuous radiation dose that affects both equipment and personnel over long exposure periods. Electronics aboard the habitat will accumulate radiation damage over years, causing gradual degradation in sensors, processors, and memory systems. This degradation is subtle. It does not announce itself with an alarm. It manifests as slightly increased error rates, occasional glitches, sensors drifting out of calibration. Over years, these small degradations compound into reliability concerns that require monitoring, testing, and eventual replacement of affected components. And the replacement components come from the finite inventory the crew brought with them. Jupiter's sheer gravitational presence also means that Callisto is not an easy place to leave. Escaping the Jovian system to return to Earth requires significant velocity change, which requires propellant, which either has to be carried from Earth or manufactured on Callisto from local water ice. If the return propellant has to be manufactured on site, that adds another complex industrial process to the list of things the crew must maintain: ice mining, water purification, electrolysis, hydrogen and oxygen liquefaction, and storage. Each step in that chain involves equipment that must operate in the extreme cold and vacuum of Callisto's surface, adding yet more systems that need maintenance, spare parts, and expertise to keep running. And that brings us the reality that underlies everything we have discussed over the course of tonight. The defining feature of life on Callisto is not the cold. It is not the vacuum. It is not the distance. It is the maintenance. The cold, the vacuum, and the distance are the conditions. Maintenance is the response. It is the constant, unending, never optional activity that keeps the conditions from killing everyone. Every system in the habitat degrades, seals wear, filters clog, pumps develop play in their bearings. Electrical connections corrode or loosen under thermal cycling. Software accumulates errors. Mechanical components fatigue. Optical sensors cloud. Valves stick. Calibration drifts. None of these failures happen on a schedule that the crew gets to choose. They happen according to the physics of material degradation, and they happen continuously. The crew does not live on Callisto, and occasionally fix things. The crew fixes things on Callisto and, in the intervals between repairs, does everything else. Growing food, monitoring life support, conducting the scientific research that justifies the mission, maintaining physical fitness, managing their own psychological well-being. But maintenance comes first. because maintenance is what keeps the air breathable, the water clean, the pressure stable, and the temperature above the point where human beings begin to die. A week without maintenance on a critical system is not a vacation. It is a gamble. A month without maintenance on a system that is showing early signs of degradation is an invitation for a failure cascade that may be difficult or impossible to reverse. The knowledge required to maintain these systems has to be deep, practical, and continuously exercised. It is not enough to have a manual in a database. Manuals describe procedures for anticipated scenarios. Real failures rarely match the manual exactly. A component fails in a way the designers did not foresee. Two systems interact in an unexpected manner. A repair procedure that works perfectly in a laboratory on Earth does not translate cleanly to a workshop in hard vacuum and deep cryogenic cold with limited tools and no supply chain. The people performing the maintenance need to understand not just the procedures, but the principles, the underlying physics and engineering that allow them to reason from first principles when the procedure does not cover what is actually happening. They need to have practiced the repair, not just read about it. They need to have the judgment to know when a temporary fix is safe and when it is merely postponing a worse failure. And they need to have all of this knowledge for every critical system in the habitat, or at least distributed across the crew, so that no single person's incapacitation leaves a critical system without a qualified maintainer. This is a profound human resource challenge. On Earth, the knowledge needed to build, operate, and maintain a complex industrial facility is distributed across thousands of specialists, supported by institutions, universities, supply chains, and an entire civilization. On Callisto, that knowledge must be compressed into a team of 6 to 10 people and kept alive through training, practice, and institutional discipline for the duration of the mission. If a crew member with critical expertise is incapacitated by illness or injury, the remaining crew must absorb that expertise from documentation and whatever cross-training was accomplished before the incapacitation occurred. If 2 crew members with complementary skills are incapacitated, the remaining team is stretched even thinner. The smaller the crew, the more catastrophic any single loss of capability becomes. A contractor cannot be called, a specialist cannot be flown in, a training course cannot be attended. The expertise that exists on Callisto when the habitat door closes is the expertise that will exist for the duration of the mission. Nothing can be added. Things can only be lost. Every aspect of the distance problem feeds into every other aspect. The communication delay means emergencies are handled locally. Local handling requires deep expertise. Deep expertise is hard to maintain in a small team. A small team is all the supply chain can support. The supply chain is limited because the distance makes resupply take years. The years-long resupply cycle means the crew must be self-sufficient. Self-sufficiency demands comprehensive spare parts, raw materials, and fabrication capability. That capability adds mass. Mass increases the mission cost and complexity. Complexity adds more systems that need maintenance. Maintenance requires more expertise. And the cycle continues, each constraint tightening every other constraint, creating a web of interdependence that has no single point where the pressure can be relieved. This is not a problem that better technology resolves cleanly. Better reactors, better life support, better medical equipment, all of these help at the margins. But the fundamental challenge, the distance, the delay, the isolation, the self-sufficiency requirement, these are not technology problems. They are consequences of where Callisto is in the solar system and what the speed of light allows. No propulsion breakthrough eliminates the reality that Jupiter is far from Earth. No communication technology overcomes the speed of light. No supply chain optimization makes multi-year resupply windows acceptable for genuinely critical component failures. The distance is not an obstacle to be overcome, it is a permanent feature of the operating environment. And every system, every procedure, every contingency plan has to be designed around the assumption that help is not coming. Not soon, not in time, not at all, unless you count messages that arrive an hour late with advice for a situation that has already played out. Everything we have covered so far, the radiation in the Jupiter system, the cold and vacuum on the surface, the total dependence on artificial life support, the nuclear power requirement, the distance from Earth, the communication delay, the supply chain impossibility, the medical isolation, the constant maintenance burden, all of it comes together into a picture that is very far from what most people imagine when they hear that Callisto is the safe moon of Jupiter. Each challenge on its own would be serious but manageable with enough resources and planning. It is the combination that makes Callisto what it truly is. Not a frontier outpost waiting to be settled. Not a stepping stone to the outer solar system. Not the obvious next chapter in human exploration. It is a survival problem of a kind that has no precedent, layered and compounded and relentless, where every system depends on every other system, and every failure radiates outward through the entire web of dependencies, until someone fixes it or the web unravels. And that is still not the most unsettling part of the picture. The most unsettling part is what all of this, taken together, means for the human beings who would actually live inside it. What it does to the mind to know that you are sealed inside a machine that must not stop, on a world that would kill you in minutes if it did, with no way to leave and no way to call for help that would arrive in time to matter. That is where this story ends. And it is where the real weight of the word survival becomes clear. Now, let's bring everything together, not as a list of challenges, not as a catalogue of engineering problems, as a single, coherent picture of what it would actually mean to be a human being living on Callisto. Because the individual systems, the heating, the air, the pressure, the water, the food, the gravity countermeasures, the power, the maintenance, the communication delay, the supply chain, the medical isolation. Each of these sounds manageable in isolation. Difficult, yes. Demanding, certainly. But when engineers describe them one at a time in clean technical language, they sound like problems that have solutions. And technically they do. Each one can be solved, at least in principle, with enough resources, enough redundancy, enough expertise. The trouble is that on Callisto, you are not solving one problem. You are solving all of them. Simultaneously. Continuously. With a finite crew, finite supplies, finite spare parts, and no margin for the kind of cascading failure that becomes possible when nothing operates independently, and all of it depends on a power source that is itself a machine requiring maintenance and fuel. The air you breathe was manufactured this morning by an electrolysis unit that split water molecules using electricity generated by a nuclear reactor. The water that fed the electrolysis unit was mined from surface ice yesterday, transported into the habitat by a vehicle that operates at minus 138 degrees Celsius, melted using heat from the reactor, and purified through a filtration system whose membranes degrade over time and must be periodically replaced from a finite inventory. The carbon dioxide you exhaled last night was scrubbed from the air by a chemical system that requires its own consumables, its own maintenance, its own power draw. The food you ate was grown under LED lights, powered by the same reactor, in nutrient solution mixed from stored chemical stocks, in a hydroponic bay whose pumps and sensors and lighting arrays all need to keep working. The warmth in the room comes from the reactor's thermal output, distributed through a heating system whose pipes and valves and controllers all degrade over time. The pressure that holds the air inside the habitat is maintained by the structural integrity of walls, seals, and airlocks that are under constant thermal stress from the difference between the heated interior and the frozen exterior. Every one of these chains terminates at the reactor, and the reactor is a machine. It has fuel that will eventually be consumed. It has components that will eventually wear. It has a cooling system that must function for the reactor to function. It has a control system that must function for the cooling system to function. And the people who maintain it must understand it deeply enough to diagnose problems that the original designers may not have anticipated. Because no designer can anticipate everything that will happen to a complex machine operating for years in an environment it was never built for. If the reactor stops, the chain doesn't break at one point. It breaks everywhere, simultaneously. Every system we have walked through tonight, heating, air, water, pressure, food, lighting, collapses together because every one of them draws from the same source. The cascade is not sequential, it is immediate and total, and the reactor itself is a single engineered system maintained by a small crew, operating at the far end of a supply chain that stretches 500 million miles back to the planet where it was built. This is what total dependence means. Not dependence on a single system, but dependence on an interlocking web of systems whose collective function produces the conditions necessary for human survival, and whose collective failure produces conditions incompatible with it. There is no partial shutdown. There is no graceful degradation to a simpler mode of living. You cannot open a window and let in fresh air while the life support is being repaired. You cannot step outside and gather firewood while the heating system is down. You cannot walk to a stream and fill a bucket while the water recycling is offline. Every resource that sustains life inside the habitat is artificial. Every one of them traces back to machines, and the machines trace back to the reactor, and the reactor traces back to the people who maintain it. And the people trace back to their training, their supplies, their health, their morale, and their ability to keep functioning under conditions that no human being has ever been asked to endure for this long, this far from home, with this little possibility of rescue. Let's talk about what daily life would feel like, not the engineering, the experience. You wake up in a small sleeping compartment. The walls are close. The air has a faint mechanical taste, the residue of filters and chemical scrubbers doing their work. The lighting is artificial, tuned to simulate a day-night cycle, but your body knows it is not sunlight. It has never been sunlight since you arrived. You dress, eat a meal assembled from hydroponically grown ingredients that you have eaten in minor variations hundreds of times before, and begin your shift. Your shift is maintenance, or it is agricultural monitoring, or it is a medical check on a crew member whose bone density is declining despite the exercise protocol, or it is an EVA, a trip outside in a pressure suit to inspect a radiator panel or repair a mining vehicle, working in gloves that are thick enough to protect you from the cold and the vacuum, but too thick to allow fine motor control, knowing that a tear in your suit is not an inconvenience, but a potential death sentence. You work your shift, you eat again, you exercise, not because you want to, but because the medical protocol requires it. Because without resistance training, your bones are losing density in the low gravity, and your muscles are weakening, and your cardiovascular system is deconditioning. And if you stop exercising for long enough, the damage becomes difficult or impossible to reverse. You have some time in the evening. You read or you watch something from the entertainment library that was loaded before launch, or you talk with the same 5 or 8 people you have talked with every day for months or years. There are no new faces, there are no visitors, there are no strangers. The social world of the habitat is a closed set, and it has been the same closed set since the day the mission began. You send a message to someone on Earth, knowing that the reply will arrive sometime tomorrow or the day after, depending on where the planets are. The message you sent last week was answered 3 days ago with news that was already old when it was sent. The conversation is not a conversation. It is an exchange of monologues, separated by an hour of silence. You look out a viewport, if the habitat has one. Jupiter dominates the sky, enormous and banded, its cloud patterns shifting slowly across its face. Callisto is tidally locked, so Jupiter does not rise or set. It hangs in the same position, always, a permanent fixture in the sky above one hemisphere. It is staggeringly beautiful. It is also a reminder of where you are. You are orbiting that planet. You are trapped in its gravitational domain. Every trajectory home passes through Jupiter's influence, and getting out requires fuel, time, and a spacecraft capable of making the journey. The sun is visible too, but it is small. At 5.2 astronomical units, the sun appears roughly 27 times smaller in area than it does from Earth. It is a bright star, the brightest object in the sky other than Jupiter, but it does not warm you. Its light reaches Callisto at roughly 4% of its Earth intensity. Too weak to heat a surface. Too weak to power meaningful solar energy collection. Too weak to feel on your skin even if you could stand outside without a pressure suit. The sun is a reminder of home. And home is a point of light you cannot reach. The psychological research on long-duration isolation and confinement has been building for decades, driven by the needs of Antarctic research stations, submarine deployments, and the International Space Station. The consistent findings are sobering. In isolated, confined environments, people experience predictable psychological effects. Cognitive performance declines over time, measured in slower reaction times, reduced working memory, impaired decision-making under stress. Emotional regulation becomes more difficult. Irritability increases. Interpersonal conflicts that would be trivial in normal life become magnified because the people involved cannot separate. There is no going home for the weekend. There is no transferring to a different posting. There is no walking away. The person you had a bitter argument with last night is sitting across from you at breakfast this morning, and will be sitting across from you at breakfast every morning for the foreseeable future. Antarctic winter over crews, the small groups of scientists and support staff who spend the dark winter months at stations near the South Pole, consistently report what researchers call the winter over syndrome, a cluster of symptoms including sleep disruption, cognitive slowing, emotional blunting, withdrawal from social interaction, and a pervasive low-grade depression that settles over the group as the months of darkness and isolation accumulate. This syndrome appears reliably across different stations, different nationalities, different crew compositions. It is not a sign of weakness. It is a predictable human response to prolonged confinement in an artificial environment with no access to the natural world, and it appears in people who know they are going home. The supply plane is coming in the spring. The darkness ends. The isolation is temporary. On Callisto, the isolation is not temporary. The winter does not end. There is no spring resupply. The crew knows every day that the habitat is their entire world, not for this season, for the duration of the mission, 4 years. And the world outside the walls is not merely uncomfortable or inhospitable, the way Antarctica is inhospitable. It is lethal. You cannot step outside for a walk to clear your head. You cannot go for a run along the perimeter to burn off frustration. Every excursion outside the habitat requires a pressure suit, a pre-breathe protocol to prevent decompression sickness, a partner for safety, a communications check, and a time limit imposed by the suit's thermal management and oxygen supply. Spontaneity does not exist on Callisto. Everything outside the habitat walls is a planned operation. The effects of this confinement on human psychology over multi-year durations are not fully known because no one has ever been confined under these conditions for this long. The closest analogues, Antarctic stations, submarine deployments, space station missions, all end. They all have a return date. The people inside them can hold on because they know the isolation is finite. A Callisto crew would need to hold on knowing that the mission lasts years, that the return journey itself takes years, and that a faster ship from Earth might not be coming within their mission window. The psychological reserves required are not just individual, they are collective. The crew's ability to function as a team, to resolve conflicts constructively, to maintain trust and mutual support under grinding chronic stress, is as critical to mission survival as the reactor or the air recycling. A crew that fractures socially can still have functioning life support and still fail the mission, because the people inside the functioning habitat are no longer able to cooperate effectively enough to maintain it. Now, consider what happens when something goes catastrophically wrong. Not a slow degradation, not a gradual decline that the crew can monitor and manage. A sudden, severe failure. A catastrophic failure in the primary water reclamation system that cannot be bypassed, leaving the crew dependent on stored reserves that will run out in weeks. A structural failure in a pressurized module caused by accumulated thermal fatigue in a weld that passed every inspection but failed under a stress cycle that exceeded the design margin. A fire in the agricultural bay that destroys the food production system and contaminates the air with combustion byproducts. Any one of these scenarios is survivable if the crew responds quickly, correctly, and with sufficient resources. Seal the affected section, activate backup systems, begin emergency repairs. These are the scenarios that mission planners train for, the contingencies that fill the emergency procedure manuals. But on Callisto, there is no evacuation. There is no escape pod that can reach Earth. There is no rescue vessel standing by in orbit. If the habitat suffers a failure that the crew cannot repair with the materials and expertise on hand, the crew does not get to leave and wait for help. They stay. They work the problem. They either fix it or they do not. And if they do not, the habitat becomes what it has always been one failure away from becoming. A sealed container on a frozen moon that is no longer capable of sustaining the people inside it. The distance that makes communication with Earth a matter of delayed monologues makes rescue a matter of years. By the time a rescue mission could be launched, equipped, and flown to Jupiter, The situation on Callisto has long since resolved itself, one way or the other. This is not a dramatic flourish. It is a straightforward assessment of the operational reality. Every crewed space mission in history has operated within the envelope of possible rescue. The Mercury and Gemini capsules could abort to Earth within hours. The Apollo missions could return from the moon in days. The space shuttle could land at multiple emergency runways. The International Space Station has Soyuz and Crew Dragon capsules permanently docked as lifeboats, capable of returning the crew to Earth within hours of an evacuation decision. Even a Mars mission, while far beyond current rescue capability, would at least have a return vehicle standing by and a transit time measured in months rather than years. A Callisto mission has none of this. The crew is beyond the reach of any rescue that current or near-future technology could provide within a useful time frame. They are, in the most literal sense, on their own. This is where the comparison with Mars becomes clarifying. Mars is often described as the next great challenge for human exploration, and it is genuinely difficult. The journey takes months. The communication delay is significant, between 3 and 22 minutes each way, depending on orbital positions. The surface is cold, with an average temperature of roughly minus 60 degrees Celsius. The atmosphere is thin, less than 1% of Earth's surface pressure, unbreathable, mostly carbon dioxide. Habitats would need to be sealed and pressurized, food would need to be grown indoors, water would need to be extracted from ice or hydrated minerals, power would come from solar panels and possibly nuclear reactors. But Mars has advantages that Callisto does not. Mars receives roughly 43% of the sunlight that reaches Earth, enough to make solar panels a viable primary or supplementary power source, enough to provide meaningful light for greenhouse agriculture. Mars has a thin but real atmosphere that provides some protection against micrometeorites and some insulation against heat loss. Marginal benefits, but not zero. Mars has a communication delay of minutes, not the better part of an hour. Real-time collaboration with Earth is strained, but possible. A resupply mission to Mars takes months, not years. Emergency scenarios can be communicated to Earth, and responses received within an hour at worst. Mars has roughly 38% of Earth's gravity, 3 times what Callisto offers, enough to provide significantly more skeletal and muscular loading, reducing though not eliminating the physiological concerns of low gravity. A person on Mars still weighs enough to feel the ground beneath them in a meaningful way, to walk without floating, to sit in a chair without drifting. On Callisto, every movement feels like slow motion, and the body slowly forgets what it was built for. And Mars is closer. The psychological knowledge that Earth is months away rather than years away matters. The knowledge that resupply is conceivable rather than theoretical matters. The knowledge that return is difficult but not impossible matters. Callisto offers none of these ameliorations. It is colder by roughly 80 degrees Celsius than Mars. It receives roughly 1/10 the sunlight that Mars receives. Its communication delay is 3 to 10 times longer. Its resupply window is measured in years rather than months. Its gravity is 1/3 of Mars's already low gravity. Its atmosphere is not thin but functionally non-existent. Every challenge that makes Mars difficult is present on Callisto in a more extreme form, compounded by the additional challenge of operating within Jupiter's gravitational domain and beyond the reach of any timely rescue. And yet Callisto is the best option in the Jupiter system. That is the sentence that should sit at the center of everything we have discussed tonight. not because it is comforting, because it is clarifying. It tells you exactly what kind of place the Jupiter system is for human beings. If the least hostile moon, the one with the lowest radiation, the most stable geology, the most accessible water ice, the most forgiving position relative to Jupiter's magnetosphere, still requires total dependence on sealed artificial habitats, nuclear power, manufactured air, processed water, indoor-grown food, and constant machine maintenance with no possibility of timely resupply or rescue, then the Jupiter system is not a place that is waiting for human settlement. It is a place that tolerates human survival, barely, provisionally, at enormous cost, and only for as long as the machines keep working. The phrase least deadly does not belong in the same sentence as the word safe. Least deadly means that compared to environments where death comes in hours, this is an environment where death comes slower, where the margins are slightly wider, where the number of separate systems that must function simultaneously to prevent catastrophe is slightly smaller. It means the gap between survival and disaster is measured in days rather than minutes, in system redundancies rather than single points of failure. That is a meaningful difference for engineering purposes. It makes mission planning possible. It makes Callisto a viable target for a human outpost in a way that Europa and Io are not. But it does not change the fundamental nature of the environment. It does not turn Callisto into a place where a human being can survive for even 1 hour without the continuous operation of machines designed, built, transported, and maintained by a civilization almost 500 million miles away. There is something important in that realization that goes beyond Callisto, beyond Jupiter, beyond any specific destination. It is a realization about the nature of human expansion into the outer solar system. We speak of colonizing other worlds as though the challenge scales linearly, as though going farther is simply going to Mars, but more so. It is not. The outer solar system represents a qualitative shift, not just a quantitative one. The challenges do not merely increase, they change in kind. On Mars, the sun is dim but present. On Callisto, it is a bright star. On Mars, the communication delay is frustrating. On Callisto, it eliminates Earth from the decision loop. On Mars, resupply is slow. On Callisto, it is a generational commitment. On Mars, the environment is harsh. On Callisto, it is incompatible with unprotected human survival by every metric simultaneously. Temperature, pressure, atmosphere, radiation, gravity, and distance. Callisto represents a threshold. On one side of that threshold are worlds where human survival is difficult but retains some connection to the conditions our biology expects. Air that can be thickened, sunlight that can be collected, gravity that approximates what our bones were built for, communication that, while delayed, still permits something resembling dialogue. On the other side of that threshold are worlds where human survival is entirely artificial, where every condition necessary for life is manufactured from scratch by machines, where the environment contributes nothing except raw materials that must be processed before they are useful, where the connection to Earth is attenuated to the point of near irrelevance for operational purposes. Callisto sits on the far side of that threshold. It is the first of the truly remote, truly hostile destinations, the beginning of a region of the solar system where human presence is not settlement in any historical sense, but a sustained engineering operation against a world that would end that operation the moment the machines stop running. And that is perhaps the deepest lesson Callisto teaches. Not that humans cannot go there. We probably can, given enough time, enough investment, Enough engineering brilliance and enough willingness to accept risks that no previous mission has carried. Not that we should not go. The scientific case for a human presence in the Jupiter system is strong. The ability to teleoperate robotic explorers on Europa from a nearby base, to study Callisto's own geology and possible subsurface ocean up close, to establish a way station for deeper exploration of the outer solar system. These are real and valuable goals. The lesson is simpler and harder than either of those questions. It is a lesson about what the word survival actually means when every component of it is artificial, when nothing in the environment supports it, when the only thing standing between a crew of human beings and the cold, dark vacuum of a frozen moon almost 500 million miles from home is a collection of machines that were built by other humans, launched across the solar system, and must now work every day, every hour, without exception, for as long as anyone plans to stay alive. Callisto is not frightening because it is the worst place humans could go. It is not the worst. It is frightening because it may be one of the best places near Jupiter, and even the best option in this part of the solar system, means living inside a sealed habitat where the air is manufactured, the water is recycled, the food is grown under artificial lights, the heat comes from splitting atoms, and the nearest help is an hour away at the speed of light and years away by spacecraft. It means waking up every morning inside a machine and knowing that if that machine fails, the environment outside will kill you in minutes. It means trusting the reactor, the seals, the filters, the pumps, the valves, the software, the sensors, and the people who maintain all of them. Because trust is not optional when every alternative to trust is death. And it means understanding, with a clarity that no one on Earth can fully share, that the word safe has been stretched so far from its original meaning that it has become something else entirely. A word that means not safe at all, but merely not immediately fatal. A word that describes not comfort or security, but the narrowest possible margin between survival and the void. That is what living on Callisto would be. Not the adventure it looks like in the artist's renderings, not the triumph it sounds like in the mission proposals. A daily, grinding, relentless act of survival performed by a handful of human beings inside a pressurized shelter on the oldest, most cratered, coldest, most remote surface in the Jovian system that anyone has seriously considered putting people on. A surface where Jupiter hangs motionless in the sky like an eye that never blinks, where the sun is a distant bright point that offers light but no warmth, where the horizon is ice and rock and dust that has not changed in 4 billion years, and where the silence outside the habitat walls is the silence of a world that has never known a voice, and does not need one. The safest moon near Jupiter. Remember that word. Safest. Let it settle. Then remember what it is being compared to. And then ask yourself what it says about Jupiter, about the outer solar system, and about the distance between human ambition and human reality. That the safest option available looks like this. Sleep well tonight. You are on a planet with an atmosphere that fills your lungs without asking, with gravity that holds your bones together, with a sun close enough to warm your skin, with water that falls from the sky, with a horizon you can walk toward without a pressure suit, and a reactor and a set of contingency plans for what to do if the seal on your helmet fails. You are on Earth, and the distance between where you are right now and the surface of Callisto, the safest moon of Jupiter, is not just measured in miles. It is measured in every breath you take without thinking about it, every glass of water you pour without filtering it, every degree of warmth you feel without generating it, every night you sleep without wondering whether the machine that keeps you alive will still be running in the morning. That is the distance, and it is far greater than 500 million miles